The call light goes on in room 14 at 11:47 p.m., and Grace Okafor has already been on her feet for 9 hours and has 4 more to go, and she sees it from the nurse's station the way she sees everything on this floor, with the specific, tireless attention of someone who has learned, across 5 years at Mercy General's cardiac care unit, that the call light is never nothing. She is 34 years old. She has been a registered nurse for 8 years, the last 5 on this unit, and in those 5 years she has developed the specific clinical acuity that the nursing literature calls pattern recognition, and that Grace herself calls, in the private taxonomy of her own professional self-understanding, knowing when something is wrong before the numbers say so. The accumulated integration of 10,000 patient encounters into a sense that operates faster than conscious analysis, that fires before the chart catches up. Room 14 is Mr. Aldous Pemberton, 67, admitted 36 hours ago with what Dr. Victor Marsh documented as atypical chest discomfort, likely musculoskeletal, cardiac workup unremarkable. His troponin levels from admission were at the low end of concerning and the high end of normal, depending on which threshold you apply, and Dr. Marsh applied the normal threshold, and Grace has been watching Mr. Pemberton for 36 hours with the specific quiet attention of someone who is watching a number that is probably fine and is not entirely sure. She goes to room 14. She does not send the aide. Mr. Pemberton is sitting up in bed, slightly forward, his breathing shallow in the specific way that Grace has learned, across 5 years, to distinguish from the shallow breathing of anxiety or discomfort. He is diaphoretic, sweating, though the room is cool. His color is the color that experienced nurses describe as not right, before the monitors confirm why. "Mr. Pemberton," she says. "What's happening?" "Pressure," he says. He puts his hand on his chest, not dramatically, but with the specific economical gesture of someone directing attention rather than performing. "And my left arm. Started maybe 20 minutes ago." Grace looks at the monitor. Heart rate elevated. Rhythm sinus but with a change from the earlier strip that is small enough that the automated alert has not fired and significant enough that Grace notices it immediately. She does not go back to the nurse's station. She stays in the room. She begins a 12-lead EKG. And then she calls Dr. Marsh. To understand what happens next, you have to understand what 5 years of this conversation looks like, the specific, accumulated texture of being the person who raises concerns and the specific, accumulated texture of having those concerns received by someone who has decided that the concerns are not quite worth the weight they're given. Their first significant disagreement had been over a patient whose respiratory status Grace had flagged 3 times in 8 hours, each time receiving a variant of the same response: "The numbers are within range, we're monitoring, let me know if anything changes." The patient had been transferred to the ICU 6 hours after Grace's 3rd flag, for respiratory failure. Dr. Marsh had written, in a transfer note, "clinical deterioration despite monitoring," a phrase that Grace had read and reread with the specific feeling of someone recognizing a narrative that does not include them. She had raised it, once, with the unit's nursing director, who had said, "These things happen. The important thing is the patient got the care they needed." Which was true, and also was not the full picture, and Grace had learned, from that conversation, that "these things happen" was the institutional response that closed rather than opened the conversation. Over 5 years, the pattern had established itself. Not with every physician. The pattern was specific to Dr. Marsh, whose response to Grace's clinical observations had developed into a predictable taxonomy: the polite dismissal, the gentle condescension, and, on 3 occasions she has counted and documented, the specific form that addresses not the clinical question but her authority to raise it. She had done everything the system provided as a mechanism for raising concerns, and the system had received each mechanism with the specific institutional capacity for absorbing complaint without changing behavior. She had, in 5 years, saved this conversation for when it mattered most. Dr. Marsh answers on the third ring. Dr. Marsh. It's Grace Okafor on cardiac care. I'm in room 14 with Mr. Pemberton, 67, admitted for atypical chest discomfort. He's presenting with new onset chest pressure radiating to the left arm, diaphoresis, and a change in his rhythm strip from baseline. I'm completing a 12 lead now. I'm concerned this is an acute MI. A pause. The specific quality of the pause that Grace has learned, across 5 years, to read accurately. Grace. His voice has the particular timbre of someone who has been woken from sleep and is managing the irritation of that alongside the professional obligation to respond. What do his troponins say? She explains. He asks about rate, rhythm. I think, Dr. Marsh says, and Grace can hear in his voice the specific professional authority of someone concluding rather than deliberating, that what you're seeing is likely anxiety-related. He's been in the hospital for 36 hours, he's a nervous patient. Let's get a repeat set of vitals in 30 minutes and a troponin draw and I'll review when the results are back. Grace is silent for exactly 3 seconds. Dr. Marsh, she says. I want to document that I am raising a concern that this patient may be having an acute cardiac event and that my clinical assessment is that he requires urgent evaluation. I would like that documented. Another pause. Different quality. You can document your assessment. I've given you my orders. Vitals in 30, troponin draw, call me with results. I understand your orders, Grace says. I'm also going to activate the rapid response team. Silence. Grace, that is within my scope of practice, she says. It is the steadiest her voice has been in 5 years of this conversation. I'm documenting this call, I'm noting your orders, and I'm activating rapid response. You'll be updated. She hangs up. What Grace Okafor knows, and has known, with increasing clarity, across 5 years of being told that what she knows is either not quite right or not quite her place to say, is built from the specific, unremarkable accumulation of 8 years of nursing practice. She knows it in the specific, empirical sense of having been in the room. Of having watched faces change color in a way that precedes monitor changes. Of having felt the specific quality of stillness that patients develop when their bodies are doing something serious and all available resources are being redirected toward managing it. Of having placed her hand on a patient's arm and understood, from the temperature and moisture of the skin, that something biochemical was happening that the 12 lead would confirm and that confirming was not the same as knowing. She knows that Mr. Aldous Pemberton, 67, is having a heart attack. She knows it the way she knows the layout of this unit in the dark, not by thinking about it but by having walked it 10,000 times, until the knowing is not in her mind but in her body, a different kind of intelligence than the kind that passes board exams. She has activated the rapid response team. She stays in the room with Mr. Pemberton. She holds his hand. I've called for more help, she tells him. Is it bad? He says. I think your heart needs some attention, she says. That's why we're here. She squeezes his hand once. You're not alone in this room. He nods. He does not say anything else. He is conserving. The rapid response team is led, tonight, by Dr. Priya Chandrasekhar, the intensivist on call, 41 years old, 12 years of critical care, the specific and unhurried efficiency of someone who has run enough rapid responses to have developed the kind of practiced calm that is not indifference but its opposite. She enters room 14, looks at Grace, and says, "Tell me." Grace tells her. Concisely, specifically, in the structured format that handoffs in critical care require, 60 seconds, everything that matters. Dr. Chandrasekhar looks at the 12 lead. She looks at the prior strip from admission. She looks at Mr. Pemberton. Mr. Pemberton. Can you rate your chest pressure on a scale of 1 to 10? 7, he says. Maybe 8. She turns to Grace. Cath lab. Now. I want cardiology on the phone in the next 3 minutes. Grace has already begun the protocol. The cardiology fellow, Dr. James Obi, second-year fellowship, arrives at 12:22 a.m. He reviews the EKG. He speaks with Mr. Pemberton for 4 minutes, which is the fastest thorough history Grace has ever watched. He looks at Grace. How long has he been symptomatic? He told me 20 minutes when I assessed him at 11:47, Grace says. I called the attending at 11:51. I activated rapid response at 11:56. Dr. Obi nods. Good catch, he says. It is 2 words. They are not effusive. They are the specific professional acknowledgement of someone who understands what the catch represents. Mr. Pemberton is transferred to the cath lab at 12:31 a.m. The artery was 92% occluded. Time from symptom onset to intervention, 87 minutes. The cardiac muscle is saved. At 7 a.m., Grace gives her handoff to the day shift charge nurse. She documents everything. She notes the timeline, the 11:47 call light, the 12 lead, the call to Dr. Marsh, the activation of rapid response, the cardiology consult, the cath lab transfer, the procedure. She does not editorialize. The documentation does not need to editorialize. It is a timeline. The gap between Dr. Marsh's orders and what the rapid response assessment indicated is visible in the timeline the way a crack in a wall is visible in a photograph of a room. You don't need to point at it. At 7:43 a.m., Dr. Marsh arrives on the unit for rounds. Grace is still completing her documentation. He comes to the nurse's station and picks up the chart for room 14 and reads what happened between 11:47 and 3 a.m. He is quiet for a long time. Grace. Dr. Marsh. The patient is stable. Recovering well from primary PCI. 92% occlusion of the LAD. Time to intervention was 87 minutes. He looks at the documentation of the phone call, which Grace has written with the specific, scrupulous accuracy of someone who has learned that what goes in the chart is what exists. She has documented, attending physician Dr. V. Marsh notified at 23:51. Clinical concern expressed for acute MI. Physician assessment, likely anxiety-related, orders for repeat vitals in 30 minutes and stat troponin. RN assessment, acute cardiac event. Rapid response team activated per nursing assessment at 23:56 per scope of practice. Every word is accurate. Every word is also a record. You documented the call, he says. I document all clinical communications, Grace says. There is a quality to his expression that Grace has not seen on him before, which is the specific quality of someone who has just encountered, in the form of a patient's outcome, information about the gap between what they believed they knew and what was actually true. At 9 a.m., Grace is called into a meeting with the nursing director, Patricia Wells, and the unit's patient safety officer, Terrence Boyd, 53, 22 years of hospital quality management, someone who received, overnight, the automatic flag that the rapid response system generates and who has pulled the last 6 months of similar flags from the cardiac care unit. Grace does not know this when she sits down. She knows only that she has been called in, and that the preparation she has done is the documentation. Because Grace Okafor has been keeping records. Not secretly, not as an act of institutional warfare, but with the specific professional discipline of someone who understood, early in her career, that the record is the only account of events that persists beyond the moment they occur, and that a nurse who does not document does not, in any institutional sense, exist. She has kept, in a personal file that exists in her apartment on a dedicated hard drive, a timeline, clinical, factual, dated, of the specific pattern she has observed across 5 years, the concerns, the dismissals, the outcomes. She brings the file to the meeting. She opens it. She sets it on the table. Terrence Boyd looks at it. He looks at Grace. "How long have you been keeping this?" 5 years, Grace says. "Since I began to notice a pattern." The file contains 43 documented clinical observations submitted formally or informally to Dr. Victor Marsh, with dates, patient identifiers de-identified, clinical details, and physician responses received. Of the 43, 11 resulted in documented patient safety events in the period following the dismissed observation, within time frames Grace has annotated with the specific causative logic of someone who has read the clinical literature. 11 of 43 is not a number that looks like coincidence. "I want to be clear," Grace says, "that I'm not presenting this as a disciplinary action against anyone. I'm presenting it as a patient safety concern. The question it raises is a systemic one, not a personal one." Terrence Boyd looks at the file. He looks at Grace. "I appreciate the distinction. This file, combined with last night's flag, is going to trigger a formal quality review." "I know," Grace says. "That's why I've been keeping it." The formal quality review takes 8 weeks. The external clinical reviewer, Dr. Miriam Osei, 57, former chair of cardiology at a major academic medical center, reviews Grace's file alongside the hospital's own patient outcome data for the same 5-year period. She calls Grace at the end of the 6th week, which is unusual, and which Grace understands to be the kind of call that people make when they want to say something the formal report will contain but that they want the person who made the report possible to hear in human terms before they read it in institutional ones. "The pattern you identified is consistent with what we found when we looked at the full data. There are 11 events in 5 years that meet the criteria for preventable adverse outcomes in the context of documented early clinical concerns that were not acted on. 11 events is not a statistical outlier in a unit this size over 5 years. It is a pattern." Grace is quiet. The review will recommend structural changes. A revised escalation protocol. A formal mechanism for nursing clinical assessment to trigger mandatory physician bedside evaluation rather than phone-based disposition. A pause. Grace. "What you built over 5 years, the documentation, the file, the specific and patient methodology of it, is the reason those recommendations will have evidentiary weight rather than being one nurse's complaint about one physician. You gave the review something to review." Grace does not feel vindicated. Vindication would require the 11 cases to be something other than what they are, which is 11 patients whose care was affected by a pattern that should have been caught earlier. She feels, instead, the specific and sober satisfaction of someone who kept a record for the right reason, not to win an argument, but because the record was the only way to make the invisible visible, and the invisible was costing people something they could not get back. The new escalation protocol, formally named the Clinical Assessment Mandatory Response Protocol, known in practice on the unit as the CAMP protocol, requires that any nursing assessment of acute patient deterioration, when formally documented as a clinical concern, triggers a mandatory physician bedside evaluation within 30 minutes, with the default being escalation to the rapid response team if the evaluation does not occur. It is, in its essential structure, a formalization of what Grace did on the night of November 14th, the recognition that nursing clinical assessment is information that the system is responsible for acting on, not optional input that individual physicians can choose to receive or decline. Dr. Victor Marsh is not terminated. He is required to complete a formal quality improvement program and reassigned to a different unit during the program period. Grace, 6 months after the night of room 14, is finishing her nurse practitioner certification. She has been offered a role in the Patient Safety and Quality Improvement Department, which she declines, because the role is advisory, and what Grace has concluded is that she does not want to be advisory. She wants to be in the room. She remains on the cardiac care unit. Night shift, by choice. She has one new practice, which she has begun since November 14th. At the start of every shift, she takes 5 minutes to review each patient's full chart, not just the nursing notes, but the physician notes, the vital trend graphs, the medication changes. "Why do you do that?" her newest colleague, a first-year nurse named Joy, asks one evening. "Because," Grace says, "by the time the call light goes on, you should already know the patient well enough to understand what the call light means. And if you don't know the patient yet, then you go to the room. And you find out. And you don't send the aide." 14 months after the night of November 14th, Mr. Aldous Pemberton sends a letter to the nursing department at Mercy General. The letter is addressed to "the night shift nurse who called for help when I didn't know I needed it." He does not know Grace's name, because he was not fully conscious for the best parts of what she did, which is the specific nature of nursing work that happens most crucially when the patient is least able to witness it. The letter is given to Grace. She reads it once, in the break room during a shift, and folds it and puts it in her bag. She does not frame it. She does not show it around. She puts it in her bag the way she has put everything that has mattered into a file or a pocket or a drawer, preserved, accessible, held in the specific way of someone who has learned that what you build over time is not for display but for use. The camp protocol is, at 14 months, being evaluated for adoption by 2 other hospitals in the regional health system. Terrence Boyd, in conversations with those hospitals, always makes the same point: the conditions that produced the change were the conditions that produced the file. The file existed because one nurse, over 5 years, built it with the specific patient conviction that what she was seeing was real, that it mattered, and that the only way to make an institution see what one person could see was to make it visible in terms the institution could not dismiss. The protocol is named after the process, not the person. The person is at the nurse's station on the night shift, 5 floors up, reviewing charts at the start of her shift, knowing her patients before they need her to. The call light in room 14 goes on at 2:17 a.m., and Grace Okafor is already on her feet.